The bodyguard wasn't watching the door for threats. He was watching the clock for the ambush, and Vicky was the only person in the restaurant who noticed the fatal pattern. She risked everything to warn the target, collapsing the trap seconds before it snapped shut, but her intervention just traded his death sentence for hers. As she walks to her car in the freezing dark, she realizes the killers she outsmarted are already waiting to collect the debt. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. Alright, let's get back into it. The December cold in the city bit through fabric and flesh alike, sharp as accusation, relentless as debt. It was 9:47 on a Friday night, but inside Donatelli's, the temperature ran 20 degrees warmer, the air thick with seared ribeye, aged scotch, and the particular musk of old money making new arrangements. The atmosphere carried weight, not celebration, but negotiation, the kind of heaviness that clung to gold-framed mirrors and leather booths that had absorbed decades of whispered deals. Sweat traced a slow path down Vicky Warren's spine beneath the starched white shirt required by management, mixing with the drugstore body spray she'd applied 14 hours ago, and the exhaustion she'd been carrying for 3 months straight. She'd been on her feet since the lunch shift began, her body moving through the dining room with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned to read hunger, impatience, and dismissal in the angle of a wrist or the tap of a finger. Her lower back screamed, her arches throbbed. The professional smile she'd worn for 4 years at this establishment was starting to feel like a mask grafted onto muscle. But she couldn't afford to slow. Not when her tips tonight would determine whether she kept the studio apartment in Ravenswood or started sleeping in her 15-year-old Honda. Not when the electric company's final notice was pinned to her fridge with a magnet shaped like a champagne bottle, ironic, considering she served $30 glasses of Dom Perignon to people who wouldn't remember her face by morning. The main dining room at Donatelli's hummed with its usual Friday crowd. Executives celebrating mergers that might collapse by Monday. Couples performing romance for an audience of one. Politicians dining with donors, their laughter carefully calibrated. Vicky slipped between tables like water finding gaps. A tray balanced perfectly on her left palm. Her movements efficient, her presence deliberately forgettable. She had trained herself in invisibility the way soldiers trained in combat through repetition, observation, and the understanding that survival often meant being overlooked. She cleared the remnants of a $50 appetizer, refilled a water glass before the request could form, smiled at a joke she'd heard 6 times this week, present when summoned, gone before becoming intrusive. That's when the front door opened, pulling cold air and absolute attention into the room. Manfredo Taylor didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The tailored black suit fit him like armor, the open collar exposing ink that climbed his throat. Symbols Vicky didn't recognize but instinctively understood, spoke of violence, survived, not performed for show. His face was weathered, handsome, carved by decisions most people would break under. His eyes moved across the room with the casual efficiency of someone who assessed threats the way others checked the weather. Behind him, his bodyguard filled the doorway, a man built like a wall, expressionless, unremarkable except for his size. Vicky had seen them before. Same corner table, same bottle of Barolo, same silence that made other diners unconsciously lower their voices. Routine was its own kind of security in Manfredo's world. Predictability meant control. She grabbed 2 menus she wouldn't need and approached their usual booth, her feet carrying her through movements she could perform in her sleep. The booth sat in the back corner, positioned so Manfredo could watch both entrances without turning his head. Strategic, intentional. "Good evening, Mr. Taylor." Her voice carried the exact pitch of professional warmth, friendly enough to be respectful, neutral enough to be forgotten. He acknowledged her with a fractional nod, his attention already elsewhere, scanning the room with the attention of a man who understood that comfort bred carelessness. "The usual?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yes." One word. Final as a closed door. The bodyguard settled into the booth across from Manfredo, his bulk making the leather creak. Vicky turned toward the bar, but something made her pause. Some instinct honed by years of watching people pretend. She glanced back. The bodyguard's eyes weren't on Manfredo. They tracked the kitchen door, then the service entrance, then the front windows. His hand rested near the lapel of his jacket, not inside it, but close, ready. His jaw worked slightly, grinding tension between molars. Manfredo reached for his phone. The bodyguard checked his watch. 3 seconds of silence. Then the bodyguard checked it again. Vicky's pulse stumbled. She'd worked enough shifts to know the difference between alertness and anxiety, between protection and coordination. This wasn't a man watching for threats. This was a man watching for timing. She forced herself to move, carrying the drink order to the bar, where Tommy, the weekend bartender, was already pulling the Barolo from the temperature-controlled cabinet. "Table 12 needs the usual," she said, her voice steady despite the cold spreading through her chest. Tommy poured with practiced efficiency, the wine catching light like dark rubies. Vicky watched the bottle fill, her mind racing through possibilities she didn't want to name. 4 years of invisible servitude had taught her to recognize patterns. The husband who ordered his wife's favorite dessert the week before asking for divorce. The business partner who suddenly paid in cash. The regular who tipped 40% the night before skipping town with unpaid tabs across 3 restaurants. People telegraphed intention. Always. You just had to be watching when no one thought you were. She lifted the tray and returned to the corner booth, her approach timed to appear unhurried. Manfredo was reading something on his phone, his expression unreadable. The bodyguard's attention snapped to her arrival, then immediately back to the exits. Vicky set the wine down with the careful precision her job demanded. Neither man acknowledged her. She should have walked away. Should have returned to table 7 where the anniversary couple needed dessert menus. Should have stayed invisible, stayed safe, stayed silent. But her feet wouldn't move, because she'd just seen the bodyguard check his watch again. And this time, his lips had moved, counting down numbers only he could hear. Vicky forced herself to walk away from the corner booth, the wine bottle now empty on her tray, her pulse beating a rhythm that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Table 7. Anniversary couple, dessert menus, normal tasks performed by normal people on normal nights. Except nothing about tonight felt normal anymore. She delivered the menus with her practiced smile, recited the specials she could perform in her sleep, and retreated toward the kitchen. But her mind wasn't on tiramisu or creme brulee. It was cataloging details her conscious brain hadn't wanted to process. The bodyguard had checked his watch 4 times in 6 minutes. Not the casual glance of someone bored or impatient. Precise checks, timed intervals, the kind of repetition that indicated synchronization with something or someone outside these walls. Vicky pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, the blast of heat and noise offering temporary cover. Line cooks shouted orders. Dishes clattered. Steam rose from industrial sinks. She set her tray down with shaking hands and pressed her palms flat against the stainless steel counter, forcing herself to breathe. You're imagining things. Tired, paranoid, seeing patterns that aren't there. But she'd learned to trust her instincts in a harder school than most people attended. Her father had been a compulsive liar, the kind who could look you straight in the eye and sell you fiction as fact. By age 12, Vicky had learned to watch hands instead of faces, to listen for hesitations between words, to notice when someone's body contradicted their mouth. That skill had saved her from bad relationships, worse roommates, and customers who smiled while planning to skip out on their bills. It had made her invaluable at Donatelli's, where discretion was currency, and the ability to read a room meant the difference between 20% tips and 50. And right now, every instinct she possessed was screaming that something catastrophic was unfolding 30 feet away. She grabbed a water pitcher, the universal excuse for approaching any table, and moved back into the dining room. Table 9 needed refills. Table 6 wanted their check. She serviced both while keeping the corner booth in her peripheral vision. Manfredo sat with the stillness of a man who'd learned early that unnecessary movement revealed weakness. His wine remained untouched, his phone now face down on the table. He spoke occasionally, his words too quiet to reach her across the ambient noise, but his body language read as relaxed, confident, unaware. The bodyguard, though. The bodyguard was a different story. His shoulders carried tension like a physical weight. His eyes continued their methodical circuit: kitchen door, front entrance, service exit, windows, repeat. The pattern never varied. His right hand hadn't moved more than 2 inches from his jacket in the last 10 minutes. And he'd stopped responding when Manfredo spoke to him. Not obviously. Not rudely. But there was a half-second delay now before acknowledgement. A microsecond, where the bodyguard had to pull himself back from wherever his attention had drifted. Vicky knew that disconnect. She'd seen it in her mother the week before she'd finally left Vicky's father. Present but not. There but gone. Already committed to a decision the rest of the world hadn't learned about yet. She refilled water glasses at table 4, her movements automatic while her mind dissected possibilities. Maybe he's sick. Maybe he got bad news. Maybe he's thinking about quitting. Except men in that position didn't quit. They either retired with honors or disappeared with none. And sick men didn't check watches with that kind of precision. No. This was something else. The front door opened, pulling her attention like a hooked fish. 2 men entered, expensive coats, forgettable faces, the kind of generic professional appearance that was almost suspicious in its blandness. They didn't wait for the hostess. Didn't scan the room looking for friends or reservations. They knew exactly where they were going. They took a table near the front windows. Direct sightline to the corner booth. Vicky's hands went cold. Stop. You're connecting dots that don't exist. This is a restaurant. People come here. But these people had the same energy as the bodyguard. That same coiled readiness dressed up as casual dinner guests. One of them ordered immediately, no menu consultation. No questions, as if he didn't care what arrived because he wouldn't be staying long enough to eat it. The bodyguard's hand moved infinitesimally closer to his jacket. Manfredo said something, a slight smile touching his mouth. The bodyguard's response came too fast, too agreeable, the kind of automatic affirmation people gave when they hadn't actually heard the question. Vicky had seen that exact dynamic 100 times. Husbands pretending to listen to wives while planning exits. Employees nodding at bosses while drafting resignation letters. The performance of engagement from people who'd already left the conversation. She moved toward the bar, her route taking her past the corner booth again. Close enough to hear Manfredo's voice, smooth as expensive leather. Told me the shipment was clean. You verified? Verified, the bodyguard confirmed. But his eyes were on his watch again. Vicky's chest tightened. She knew what she was seeing now. Had known for the last 5 minutes but hadn't wanted to name it. This wasn't nervousness. This wasn't doubt. This was a man waiting for a signal. And Manfredo Taylor, who'd survived long enough in his world to afford corner booths and custom suits, had no idea the threat was sitting across from him. Checking the time until betrayal became action. Vicky reached the bar and set down her tray, her hands trembling badly enough that Tommy noticed. You good? He asked. She wasn't. But she nodded anyway. Because what else could she do? Tell someone that instinct and observation had revealed a plot she couldn't prove? Call the police and explain that a bodyguard looked too alert? Sound insane and lose the only job keeping her off the street? Or watch a man die because silence was safer than risk? Vicky's hands shook as she gripped the bar counter, her knuckles white against the dark wood. Tommy had already moved down to serve another server, leaving her alone with a choice that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark, knowing the fall would kill her but unable to see any other path forward. 30 feet away, Manfredo Taylor sat in his usual corner booth, completely unaware that the man paid to protect him was counting down seconds to his execution. She could walk away, should walk away, return to table 7, deliver desserts, collect tips, go home to her studio apartment and pretend this night had been like any other, survive through silence the way she'd survived everything else. But her feet were already moving. Not toward the kitchen, not toward safety, toward the corner booth. Her body made the decision before her mind could construct all the reasons it was suicide. Every instinct screaming self-preservation was drowned out by a louder voice, one that remembered what it felt like to watch her mother ignore danger until it was too late. To stay silent when speaking might have changed everything. She grabbed the wine bottle from the bar, though Manfredo's glass was still 3/4 full. The professional excuse. The server's camouflage. Her approach felt like walking through water, each step requiring more force than the last. The dining room, noise, laughter, conversation, clinking silverware faded into white static. Her vision tunneled until all she could see was the booth, the 2 men, and the trap she was about to spring or walk into. The bodyguard's eyes tracked her approach with the flat assessment of a predator evaluating threat level. She registered as none, just the help, invisible as furniture. That invisibility had protected her for 4 years. Tonight, she was going to weaponize it. Excuse me, Mr. Taylor. Her voice came out steady, professional, utterly unremarkable. Would you care for more wine? Manfredo glanced up from his phone, his dark eyes settling on her with the kind of attention that made most people nervous. Not cruel, not kind, simply absolute. No, thank you. This was the moment. The single breath between safe and irreversible. Vicky leaned forward as if reaching for his glass, bringing herself close enough that the expensive cologne he wore mixed with the faint smell of wine and leather. Close enough that when she spoke, only he would hear. Close enough that if she was wrong, he could kill her before she straightened. Her lips barely moved. The words came out on an exhale, quiet as confession. Your bodyguard sold you out. Tonight, you're the payment. Then she straightened, lifted the glass that didn't need refilling, and walked away on legs that threatened to give out with every step. She didn't look back. didn't wait for acknowledgement, didn't allow herself to process what she'd just done. Her body carried her through automatic motions back to the bar, setting down the glass, picking up dessert orders for table 7, while her mind screamed at the magnitude of the gamble she'd just made. If she was right, she'd saved a life. If she was wrong, she'd just accused a man of treason to someone who could make her disappear without disturbing his dinner. Either way, there was no taking it back. Behind her, the dining room continued its oblivious rhythm. Laughter at table 3, a marriage proposal at table 11, the pianist in the corner transitioning from Sinatra to Gershwin. Normal people having normal nights, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted in the space they occupied. Vicky delivered tiramisu to the anniversary couple with hands that felt disconnected from her body. Smiled, wished them well, moved like an automaton through tasks she'd performed 1,000 times, but her awareness was locked on the corner booth. Manfredo hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, hadn't given any indication he'd heard her at all. The bodyguard continued his vigilant circuit exits, windows, watch, repeat. Maybe she'd whispered too quietly. Maybe the ambient noise had swallowed her words. Maybe. Manfredo set his phone on the table and said something to his bodyguard. The words were inaudible from her position, but the bodyguard responded with a nod. Then Manfredo stood, buttoning his suit jacket with casual precision. Vicky's heart stopped. He's leaving. Different exit, different timing. It was the smallest deviation, a crack in routine so subtle most people wouldn't notice. But she'd built a career on noticing, and this was Manfredo Taylor altering his pattern without explanation, without discussion, without his bodyguard's input. He believed her. The bodyguard stood as well, confusion flickering across his face for a microsecond before training smoothed it away. But Vicky saw it. The moment control slipped. The instant he realized the script had changed. "We're leaving through the kitchen," Manfredo said, his voice carrying just far enough for Vicky to hear. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered to a man who was supposed to protect but not question. "The front is closer," the bodyguard began. "The kitchen." Manfredo's tone didn't rise. Didn't need to. It carried the weight of finality. And fear. Not Manfredo's fear. The bodyguard's. Because a plan designed around one exit, one timeline, one predictable routine had just collapsed, and the man who'd orchestrated betrayal now had to follow his target through an unplanned route, while maintaining the fiction of loyalty. Vicky watched them move toward the kitchen entrance, Manfredo leading with the calm of a man who'd simply changed his mind, the bodyguard following with the rigidity of someone whose entire world had just fractured. The two men at the front table, the ones who'd arrived with too much purpose and too little interest in food, shifted in their seats. One touched his ear, the universal sign of someone receiving information through an earpiece. Their meals sat untouched, their attention locked on the kitchen door that had just swallowed their target. And Vicky realized with cold certainty that she hadn't just saved Manfredo Taylor's life. She'd made herself a witness to whatever happened next. The kitchen door swung shut behind Manfredo and his bodyguard, cutting off Vicky's view but not her awareness. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stood frozen in the middle of the dining room, a dessert menu clutched in hands that had gone numb. At the front table, both men were moving now. Not running. Nothing that would attract attention. But their casual dinner posture had evaporated, replaced by the coiled readiness of people whose carefully constructed plan had just been lit on fire. One spoke into his sleeve. The other dropped cash on the table too much. No time to wait for change, and they both headed for the front door, not toward the kitchen, toward the street, the alley. They're going to cut him off in the alley. Vicky's body moved before her mind finished the thought. She abandoned the dessert menu on an empty table and pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen, the blast of heat and shouting voices hitting her like a physical wall. Manfredo and his bodyguard were halfway across the kitchen, weaving through the chaos of line cooks and dishwashers. The bodyguard's hand was now inside his jacket, no more pretense, no more patience. But Manfredo maintained his unhurried pace, as if he were simply inspecting the kitchen on his way out. "Vicky, you can't be back here during service," the head chef started, but she ignored him, her eyes locked on the service exit at the far end of the kitchen, the door that led to the alley. The door Manfredo was walking toward like a man who didn't know he was heading into an ambush. He knows. He changed the route. He's not stupid, but changing the route didn't mean safety. It meant the trap would have to adjust. Vicky grabbed her coat from the employee rack near the back, her fingers fumbling with the zipper. "Smoke break," she muttered to no one in particular, and slipped out the service entrance 3 seconds after Manfredo and his bodyguard. The December cold hit her like a slap, stealing her breath and clearing her head simultaneously. The alley stretched 40 feet in either direction, brick walls on both sides, a single flickering streetlight at the far end casting more shadow than illumination. Manfredo stood 5 feet from the door, his back to the wall, his eyes on his bodyguard who'd moved ahead toward the street exit. The posture looked casual, a man letting his security check the route, but Vicky recognized it now for what it was. Strategic positioning. A man making sure walls protected his back while keeping potential threats in his line of sight. The bodyguard reached the alley opening and stopped. His hand was fully inside his jacket now. His head turned left, then right, scanning the street, waiting for backup that should have already been there. Vicky pressed herself against the cold brick near the service door, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. She shouldn't be here. Had no business watching whatever was about to unfold. Should go back inside where it was warm and safe, and her responsibility ended with delivering food and collecting tips. But her feet stayed planted. A black sedan pulled up to the alley entrance. Too smooth, too well-timed. The bodyguard's shoulders relaxed, a fraction relief, recognition, and he stepped forward. That's when Manfredo moved. Not toward the car, toward the opposite end of the alley. "Wait," the bodyguard started, confusion cracking through his professional mask. But Manfredo was already 20 feet away, his stride purposeful, unhurried. A man who'd simply decided to walk instead of ride. The sedan's doors opened. The two men from the restaurant emerged, their forgettable faces now sharp with purpose and escalating panic. They'd planned for a target walking into their hands. Instead, they were watching him disappear in the wrong direction, while their inside man stood frozen between loyalty and conspiracy. "Stop him," one of them hissed at the bodyguard. And there it was. The moment fiction became fact. The bodyguard's hand emerged from his jacket holding a weapon that looked too heavy for the situation, too final for any explanation that didn't involve murder. He turned toward Manfredo's retreating figure, the metal catching what little light the alley offered. Vicky's breath stopped. But Manfredo didn't run, didn't duck, didn't react like a man surprised. He'd known. The entire walk through the kitchen, the casual exit, the deliberate positioning, he'd been waiting for this exact confirmation. "I wouldn't." Manfredo's voice carried through the cold air, calm as a man commenting on weather. He didn't turn around. Didn't need to. The roof. 3 o'clock, and behind the dumpster at 9. The bodyguard's eyes flicked upward, then left. Movement materialized from shadow shapes Vicky hadn't noticed before resolving into men with the kind of readiness that made the restaurant crew look like children playing dress-up. They'd been there the whole time, waiting, watching. He brought his own insurance. The weapon lowered, not dropped, just reconsidered. The men from the sedan were already backing toward their car, their plan decomposing in real time. No shots fired, no screaming. Just the quiet collapse of a conspiracy that had depended entirely on surprise and routine. The sedan's engine revved. Tires squealed against wet pavement as it disappeared into traffic, leaving the bodyguard standing alone in the alley, a man whose life expectancy had just shortened to minutes. Manfredo finally turned around. His expression hadn't changed, still calm, still assessing. He looked at his former bodyguard with the detached interest of someone examining an insect. "How much?" he asked. Simple question, devastating implications. The bodyguard's mouth opened, closed. The weapon hung uselessly in his grip. "Doesn't matter." Manfredo's attention shifted, his dark eyes finding Vicky pressed against the brick wall near the service door. Not surprised she was there. Not angry, just aware. "You should go back inside," he said. Not a threat, a suggestion that carried the weight of experience. "It's cold out here." Then he walked past his former protector without another glance, his pace unchanged, his suit somehow still immaculate despite the freezing alley and collapsing assassination attempt. The men who'd materialized from shadow moved with him. A new security detail that had always been there, just invisible until needed. The bodyguard stood alone in the center of the alley. His betrayal confirmed, and his usefulness expired. Vicky didn't see what happened next. She'd already slipped back through the service door into the kitchen's warmth, her legs shaking so badly she had to grab the prep counter for support. She'd been right. And now everyone knew she'd been watching. Vicky made it through the rest of her shift on autopilot, her body performing tasks her mind had abandoned entirely. She smiled at customers she wouldn't remember, delivered plates she didn't see, collected tips with hands that still trembled hours after the alley. The corner booth remained empty for the rest of the night. No one asked about Manfredo Taylor. No one mentioned the bodyguard who'd left through the kitchen and never returned. Donatelli's operated on a specific code. You didn't ask questions about absences, especially when those absences involved men who commanded silence the way others commanded attention. By the time she clocked out at 1:47 a.m., exhaustion had settled into her bones like cement. Her feet screamed with every step toward the employee lockers. Her tips for the night, $340, decent for a Friday, felt meaningless against the weight of what she'd witnessed. She'd saved a man's life and watched a conspiracy collapse in real time. And now she just wanted to go home. The employee lot sat behind the restaurant, a poorly lit rectangle of cracked asphalt bordered by chain-link fence. 8 cars tonight. Her Honda sat in the far corner where she always parked, away from the building where door dings were inevitable. The December cold had somehow gotten worse, dropping below 20 degrees, turning her breath into thick clouds. Vicky pulled her coat tighter and started across the lot, her keys already in her hand, apartment key positioned between her knuckles the way her mother had taught her before Vicky was old enough to understand why. That instinct, ingrained by years of closing shifts and empty parking lots, saved her life. She heard it before she saw it. The shift of weight, the scrape of shoe against asphalt. Movement where there should have been stillness. A man stepped out from between 2 cars, blocking her path to her Honda. Tall, heavy coat, face partially obscured by a raised collar, and the lot's terrible lighting. Vicky stopped walking. Her pulse kicked into overdrive. Long shift? His voice carried false friendliness, the kind that made her skin crawl. She didn't answer. Survival instinct screamed at her to turn around, go back inside, find witnesses and light and people. But a second man had materialized behind her, cutting off retreat. They waited. They knew when my shift ended. "We just want to talk," the first man said, taking a step closer. "About what you saw tonight." Her throat closed. Every self-defense lesson she'd half learned from YouTube videos evaporated from her memory. She was exhausted, outnumbered, trapped in a parking lot that suddenly felt 1,000 miles from safety. "I didn't see anything." The lie came out shakier than she'd intended. "That's not what we heard." Another step, close enough now that she could smell cigarettes and something chemical, cologne, or cleaning product. She couldn't tell. "See, we have a problem. Our business got interrupted." And someone whispered something they shouldn't have. Vicky's hand tightened around her keys, the metal biting into her palm. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't." His tone shifted, friendly mask dropping. "But here's the thing about witnessing stuff that's none of your business. Witnesses make people nervous, and nervous people do stupid things." The man behind her moved closer. She could feel his presence like pressure against her spine. "So we need to make sure," the first man continued, "that you understand keeping your mouth shut isn't optional. It's survival." "I won't say anything." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I swear, I just want to go home." "Yeah, we'll make sure you get there safe." The smile that accompanied those words held no warmth. "Right after we have a longer conversation, somewhere more private. This is how it happens. This is how people disappear." Vicky's mind raced through impossible options. Run, but where? Scream, but who would hear? Fight, but against 2 men twice her size? The first man reached for her arm. "I wouldn't." The voice came from the darkness near the fence line, calm and absolute in its authority. All 3 of them froze. Manfredo Taylor stepped into the weak circle of streetlight, his black suit somehow still immaculate despite the late hour. He wasn't alone. 2 men flanked him, not the obvious muscle from the alley, but quieter presence that felt infinitely more dangerous. "This doesn't concern you," the man closest to Vicky said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. She whispered in my ear. Manfredo's tone carried the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to slow children. "That makes her my concern. We're just having a conversation." "No." Manfredo moved closer, his stride unhurried. "You're making a mistake. The kind that shortens lifespans." The 2 men exchanged glances. Whatever hierarchy they answered to, whatever plan they'd been following, was colliding with a reality they hadn't prepared for. "Walk away," Manfredo continued. "Now, while you still can." For 3 seconds, the parking lot held its breath. Then the men moved, backing toward a sedan Vicky hadn't noticed parked near the street. No running, no threats. Just the quiet retreat of people who'd suddenly realized they'd miscalculated badly. The sedan pulled away with deliberate slowness, taillights disappearing around the corner. Vicky's legs gave out. She would have hit the asphalt if one of Manfredo's men hadn't caught her arm, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "You followed me," she managed, her voice hoarse. "Yes." Manfredo studied her with those dark eyes that saw too much. "You noticed a threat I'd missed. That makes you either remarkably perceptive or remarkably foolish." You saw what everyone else missed." He gestured toward her Honda. "Get in your car. Follow us." "What? No. I just want to go home." "You can't. Not cruel, just factual. Not anymore. Those men know where you work, which means they know where you live. Your routine, your schedule. Everything that made you invisible is now what makes you vulnerable." The truth of it hit like ice water. She'd stepped out of the shadows to whisper a warning, and now the shadows wouldn't take her back. "What am I supposed to do?" The question came out broken, exhausted. Manfredo's expression softened fractionally. "Tonight, you come with me somewhere safe. Tomorrow, we figure out what happens to someone who saved my life at the cost of their own anonymity." He turned toward a black Mercedes idling near the lot entrance, then paused. "You were right, by the way, about the bodyguard." His voice carried something that might have been respect. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Fewer would have spoken. "I wish I hadn't," Vicky whispered. "No." Manfredo met her eyes. "You don't. Not really. Because staying silent would have killed me. And living with that, with knowing you could have acted and didn't, that's worse than any danger you're facing now." Then he walked away, leaving Vicky standing in an empty parking lot, her keys still clutched between shaking fingers, her invisibility shattered beyond repair. Vicky followed the Mercedes through streets she'd driven 1,000 times but had never seen like this, empty, hostile, full of shapes that could be threats or shadows or nothing at all. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached, her eyes flicking between the red taillights ahead and her rearview mirror, searching for headlights that followed too closely or turned too many of the same corners. Every instinct screamed that she was making a catastrophic mistake. Getting in her car and following a Mafia boss to an unknown location wasn't survival, it was suicide with extra steps. But going home meant being alone, unprotected, waiting for men who knew her address and her schedule and had already demonstrated they were willing to make her disappear. At least following Manfredo meant witnesses, meant someone knew where she was, meant the devil you could see instead of the one waiting in your apartment. The Mercedes turned into an underground parking garage beneath a building that looked like it cost more per month than Vicky made in a year. Glass and steel and the kind of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. The gate lifted without anyone pressing a button, and Vicky followed the taillights down 2 levels into fluorescent-lit concrete that smelled of expensive cars and industrial cleaner. She parked where Manfredo's driver indicated, between the Mercedes and a Range Rover that probably cost more than her entire life, and sat for 5 seconds with her engine running, giving herself one last chance to flee. But where would she go? Back to her studio apartment with its flimsy lock and ground-floor windows? To a friend's couch, dragging danger to people who'd never asked for it? To the police, to report that she'd witnessed a crime that left no evidence and involved people who made problems disappear? She turned off the engine. Manfredo waited near the elevator, his patience seemingly infinite. When she finally emerged from her Honda, aware of how out of place her 15-year-old car looked in this garage, he simply gestured toward the open elevator doors. No threats, no pressure, just an invitation that felt like inevitability. The elevator climbed in silence, the only sound the mechanical hum and Vicky's too loud breathing. Manfredo's 2 men stood like bookends, their presence somehow both comforting and terrifying. They'd protected her in the parking lot. They could just as easily be the ones making sure she didn't leave. The doors opened directly into a penthouse apartment that redefined every assumption Vicky had about how the other half lived. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, lights spreading like jewels on black velvet. The furniture was minimal but clearly expensive, the kind that looked simple because someone had spent a fortune making it appear effortless. Art that Vicky suspected was real hung on walls, painted colors she didn't have names for. "Sit." Manfredo gestured toward a leather sofa that probably cost more than her car. "You want coffee? Water? Something stronger? I want to understand what's happening." Vicky remained standing, her coat still buttoned, her purse clutched like a shield. "Why did those men come after me?" "Because you interfered." Manfredo shrugged off his suit jacket, revealing the tattoos that climbed his arms, symbols and script in languages she didn't recognize. "My former bodyguard was working for people who don't appreciate disruption. You disrupted them, loudly," I whispered. And that whisper collapsed a plan 6 months in the making. He poured 2 glasses of what looked like whiskey, offering one to her. When she didn't take it, he set it on the coffee table between them. They'd been grooming him, paying him, waiting for the perfect opportunity. You destroyed all of that in 3 seconds. Vicky finally sank onto the sofa, exhaustion overwhelming fear. "So, they want me dead. They want you silent." Manfredo took the chair across from her, his posture relaxed despite the conversation's content. Dead is one option. Scared enough to disappear is another. Discredited is a third. There are many ways to eliminate a problem. I'm not a problem. I'm a waitress. You were a waitress. His correction was gentle but absolute. Now you're a witness. And someone who has my attention. Those two things make you exponentially more complicated. The weight of it settled over her like concrete. She'd gone to work yesterday morning as Vicky Warren, invisible server, struggling to pay rent and survive another double shift. She'd go to bed tonight if she slept at all, as someone dangerous people wanted silenced. I didn't ask for this. Her voice cracked. No one does. Manfredo leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his dark eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. But you acted anyway. You saw danger and chose to speak instead of staying safe. That takes a specific kind of courage. It takes stupidity. Sometimes those are the same thing. A slight smile touched his mouth. There and gone. The question now is what happens next. Vicky forced herself to meet his gaze. You tell me. You're the one who brought me here. I brought you here because I owe you a debt. You saved my life. That's not something I take lightly. He picked up his glass, studying the amber liquid. So I'm offering you a choice. 2 paths. Both have consequences. Her chest tightened. I'm listening. First option, I make you disappear. New city, new name, new life. I have resources that can accomplish that. You'd be safe, but you'd lose everything. Your job, your apartment, your history. Everyone you know would have to believe you simply left. He paused, letting that sink in. You'd be invisible again. But this time by design, not by default. The thought of vanishing, becoming someone else, somewhere else, felt like death by another name. And the second option? Manfredo set down his glass with careful precision. You step into my world, fully, completely. I protect you, train you, teach you how to operate in spaces where perception is currency and silence is survival. You become someone people notice, but for the right reasons. You mean work for you. I mean learn from me. His tone sharpened. There's a difference. You already have the instincts. You proved that tonight. But instincts without training get people killed. Vicky's mind raced through implications she didn't fully understand. And if I say no to both, then you walk out that door and handle whatever comes next on your own. Manfredo's expression revealed nothing. I won't stop you, won't force you, but those men in the parking lot won't be the last. And next time, I might not be there. The apartment's silence pressed against her ears. Outside those floor-to-ceiling windows, the city continued its oblivious existence, people sleeping, working, living lives where the biggest decision was what to eat for breakfast. Vicky had lost that luxury the moment she'd leaned close and whispered a warning. Why? The question came out hoarse. Why offer me anything? You don't know me. Don't owe me beyond tonight. Manfredo stood, moving to the windows, his silhouette dark against the city lights. Because most people wouldn't have done what you did. They'd have stayed silent, stayed safe, stayed invisible. You chose differently. That tells me something about who you are. It tells you I'm an idiot. It tells me you're someone who acts when action matters. He turned back to face her. Those people are rare and valuable, and usually dead by 30 because they don't know how to channel courage into strategy. He crossed back to where she sat, extending his hand, not a threat but an offer. So choose, Vicky Warren. Disappear into safety, or step forward into something you can't predict. But choose knowing that either way, the woman who served tables and blended into backgrounds is gone. What remains is up to you. Vicky stared at his offered hand, her entire future balanced on whether she took it. She thought of her studio apartment with its overdue bills and broken heating, of double shifts and aching feet and customers who never remembered her face, of 4 years perfecting invisibility because visibility meant risk. And she thought of the moment in that alley when shadows had resolved into men with weapons, and Manfredo Taylor had stepped forward to protect someone who'd protected him first. She reached out and took his hand. Teach me, she said, her voice steady for the first time all night. I choose forward. Vicky spent the night in a guest room that felt like a museum exhibit, too pristine, too expensive, too far removed from anything she recognized as home. She didn't sleep, just lay on sheets with a thread count she didn't know existed, staring at a ceiling that cost more than her yearly rent, wondering if she'd made the right choice or signed her death warrant with a handshake. By the time dawn broke over the city, painting the floor-to-ceiling windows gold and rose, she'd replayed the decision 1,000 times and arrived at the same conclusion. There was no going back. The woman who'd served tables at Donatelli's was gone. What remained was someone she didn't recognize yet. A knock on the door pulled her from thoughts that had been circling the same drain for hours. She opened it to find one of Manfredo's men, the one who'd caught her arm in the parking lot holding a garment bag and a small leather box. "Mr. Taylor wants you downstairs in 20 minutes, he said, his tone neither friendly nor hostile. Professional, as if delivering instructions to someone who mattered. "These are for you." He left before she could ask questions. Inside the garment bag hung clothes that actually fit: black pants, a silk blouse in deep charcoal, a tailored jacket that felt like armor when she put it on. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed money, but the quality was undeniable, the kind that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. The leather box held something that made her hands shake: a pendant, small, understated, hanging from a delicate silver chain. The symbol etched into the dark metal meant nothing to her geometric patterns that could have been decorative or could have been a language she didn't speak. But she understood its significance without explanation. This was the mark Manfredo had mentioned, the symbol of protection that would change how the world looked at her. Vicky fastened it around her neck with trembling fingers, the metal cool against her skin. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The exhausted waitress in a stained uniform had been replaced by someone who looked like they belonged in places she'd only ever served. The transformation felt like a costume, like playing pretend in someone else's life. 20 minutes. She found Manfredo in the kitchen, a space so immaculate it looked unused, all marble and stainless steel and natural light. He stood at the counter with an espresso cup that looked absurdly small in his tattooed hands, dressed in charcoal gray today, his collar open as always. His eyes went immediately to the pendant at her throat. "It suits you," he said simply. "What does it mean?" Vicky touched the metal, warm now from her skin. "It means you're under my protection. Anyone who sees it knows that touching you means answering to me." He set down his cup. "It's a shield, but also a brand. Once you wear it, neutrality ends. People will choose sides based on whose symbol you carry." The weight of it felt heavier than the actual metal. "Can I take it off?" "Anytime you want. But the knowledge that you wore it, that stays. You can remove the symbol, but not what it represents." Vicky's hand dropped. "So I'm marked either way." "You were marked the moment you whispered in my ear." Manfredo moved to the counter, pouring a second espresso from a machine that probably cost more than her Honda. "This just makes it official, visible. Gives you armor instead of leaving you exposed." He handed her the cup. She took it automatically, the porcelain delicate enough to feel dangerous in her grip. "We're going out today," he continued. "Places you've probably walked past 1,000 times but never entered. I need you to see how the pendant changes interactions, how doors open differently, how people's eyes shift when they notice what you're wearing." "Why?" The espresso burned her tongue, bitter and strong. "Because understanding power means observing it first." He grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair. "You can't navigate this world if you don't see how it operates. And you can't protect yourself if you don't know what the symbol around your neck actually does." 20 minutes later, Vicky sat in the back of the Mercedes, watching the city pass outside tinted windows. The morning commute clogged the streets, people rushing to jobs, to lives, to routines she'd been part of yesterday and was 1,000 miles from today. Their first stop was a coffee shop in the financial district, not a chain, a place with imported beans and minimal signage, and the kind of clientele that wore suits worth more than cars. Manfredo held the door for her, a gesture that would have seemed chivalrous if it hadn't felt like a test. Inside, the barista's eyes went immediately to the pendant at Vicky's throat. The change was microscopic but unmistakable. His posture straightened. His smile shifted from service industry automatic to something more genuine, more careful. "Good morning," he said, and the deference in his voice made Vicky's skin crawl. "What can I get you?" She ordered the same coffee she'd ordered 1,000 times, basic, cheap, unremarkable. But when it arrived, it came in a real cup instead of paper, with a small biscotti she hadn't asked for, with attention that felt unearned. "Notice anything?" Manfredo asked quietly as they left, his own coffee untouched. "He was scared," Vicky said. "Respectful," Manfredo corrected. "There's a difference. Fear makes people unpredictable. Respect makes them careful. That pendant tells people you're connected to someone who values control over chaos. They adjust accordingly." The day continued like that, a curated tour through a city she thought she knew. A restaurant where the host seated them immediately despite a 40-minute wait. A boutique where the owner greeted Manfredo by name and offered Vicky champagne she didn't want. A gallery where art she'd never afford suddenly felt accessible simply because of the metal against her collarbone. By afternoon, Vicky felt like she was drowning in attention she hadn't earned. Every interaction was performance. Every smile calculated. Every gesture of respect felt like a debt she didn't know how to repay. "I hate this," she said finally, standing outside a building she recognized Donatelli's, her former workplace, the restaurant where everything had started. "Good," Manfredo said. "That means you understand the weight. People who enjoy this kind of power are dangerous. People who fear it are smart." He gestured toward the familiar entrance. "One more stop. This one matters most." Vicky's stomach clenched. "I can't go in there. I just quit without notice. Without explanation. You're not here to apologize." Manfredo's tone was firm. "You're here to show them who you've become, to prove that invisibility was a choice you made, not a limitation you accepted." The door opened before she could protest further. Inside, the lunch shift was in full chaos. Servers moved with the same mechanical precision she'd perfected, the same exhaustion she'd carried, the same invisibility she'd weaponized. And then they saw her. Saw the clothes that fit like armor. Saw the pendant at her throat. Saw her standing next to Manfredo Taylor as if she belonged there. The head server, Angela, who'd trained Vicky 4 years ago, stopped mid-stride, her tray balanced, her expression shifting through confusion to recognition to something that might have been respect. "Vicky," she said, the name a question. "Angela." Vicky's voice was steady, carrying across the dining room with authority she didn't know she possessed. "I came to return this." She pulled her work shirt from her bag, washed, folded, no longer needed, and set it on the host stand. "Thank you for everything you taught me. I'm done serving." Then she turned and walked out, Manfredo beside her, leaving behind 4 years of invisibility and stepping fully into a world that would never let her hide again. The training began the next morning in a way that shattered every expectation Vicky had built from movies and television. No weapons, no combat techniques, no dramatic transformation montages set to pounding music. Instead, Manfredo sat her at a cafe table with a newspaper and a simple instruction: watch. For 3 hours, she watched people, studied their patterns, observed how couples interacted, how business associates negotiated space, how strangers maintained distance or violated it. Manfredo said nothing, offered no guidance, simply sat across from her reading his own paper while she cataloged human behavior like a scientist documenting a foreign species. "What did you see?" he asked finally, folding his newspaper with precise creases. Vicky's mind raced through observations she wasn't sure mattered. The couple at table 4, they're breaking up. She keeps checking her phone. He keeps trying to make eye contact. The businessman at the counter ordered decaf, but told his caller he was on his 3rd espresso, which means he's lying about working late. The woman by the window has checked the door 17 times in the last hour. She's waiting for someone who isn't coming. Manfredo's expression revealed nothing. How do you know the couple is breaking up and not just having a bad day? Because she angled her body away from him 3 minutes after they sat down. People lean toward what they want and away from what they're leaving. She's already gone. She just hasn't said it yet. And the businessman? Decaf at 10 in the morning means sleep problems or health concerns. But claiming caffeine means he needs an excuse for being unavailable. He's hiding something that requires energy he doesn't have. For the first time, something that might have been approval flickered across Manfredo's face. "You already know how to see. Now you need to learn what to do with what you see." The days that followed built on that foundation with relentless focus. Not physical training, though. Manfredo insisted she learn basic self-defense. Enough to buy seconds when seconds mattered, but psychological conditioning that felt like rewiring her brain. He taught her to identify lies not through words, but through micro-expressions that lasted milliseconds. To recognize nervousness versus coordination, fear versus performance, loyalty versus its carefully constructed imitation. "Everyone leaks information," he explained during a session where he'd brought in 3 of his associates and asked her to identify which one was planning to betray him. "The question is whether you're watching when they do." She'd chosen wrong the first time, and the second. By the 3rd attempt, she'd learned to watch hands instead of faces, to notice who checked exits and who ignored them, to identify the person most comfortable with Manfredo's attention versus the one who avoided it. The training expanded beyond observation into application. Manfredo took her to meetings, business negotiations that felt more like chess matches played with human pieces. She sat silently in corners, watching men with expensive suits and cheaper morals try to maneuver around someone who'd spent decades reading intentions before they became actions. "What did you notice?" became his constant refrain, and Vicky learned to answer with details that mattered. The lawyer who touched his wedding ring when lying. The businessman whose left eye twitched before making concessions he'd already planned. The investor who smiled too much, performing confidence to mask the desperation that showed in how tightly he gripped his briefcase. "You're thinking like a server?" Manfredo told her after one particularly tense negotiation, watching to anticipate needs. But this world requires you to think 3 moves ahead, not what they need now, what they'll need next, and how that need makes them vulnerable. So she learned to project forward, to see patterns not just in the moment, but in how they'd develop, to understand that power wasn't about dominating a room, but about knowing which person in that room would shift the balance if pushed correctly. The hardest lesson came during a late-night session in Manfredo's study, a room lined with books and languages she didn't speak, and art she suspected was stolen. "You're good at reading people," he said, pouring wine she'd learned to accept even though she rarely drank it. "Exceptional even. But you still flinch when you think you've made someone uncomfortable. Still apologize with your body language when you've done nothing wrong." Vicky started to protest, then stopped. He was right. Years of service industry conditioning had trained her to make herself smaller, to absorb blame, to smooth over tension at the cost of her own dignity. "That reflex will get you killed," Manfredo continued, his tone neither cruel nor kind, simply factual. "In this world, hesitation reads as weakness. Apology reads as admission. You don't have to be aggressive, but you cannot be uncertain. I don't know how to do that." The admission felt like failure. "Yes, you do." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. "You did it the night you whispered in my ear. You saw a threat, calculated the risk, and acted anyway. That's not uncertainty, that's controlled courage. You just need to apply it beyond life and death moments." So she practiced, holding eye contact past the point of comfort, speaking her observations without qualifying them with maybe or I think, walking into rooms as if she had every right to occupy space instead of apologizing for her presence. It felt like learning a new language, one where confidence was grammar and certainty was syntax and doubt was an error that could get you killed. 6 weeks after the night in the parking lot, Manfredo brought her to a private club, the kind without signs, where membership was inheritance and money alone couldn't buy access. Men in their 60s and 70s occupied leather chairs like thrones, discussing markets and politics and the kind of casual corruption that shaped cities. "Why are we here?" Vicky asked, studying the room with eyes that had been trained to see past performance. "Because these men hold power that politicians only borrow." Manfredo guided her toward a corner where 3 men sat around a table scattered with chess pieces and whiskey glasses. "And I want them to meet someone who reads people better than they read quarterly reports." The introduction was brief. Names she recognized from newspapers, faces that smiled without warmth, handshakes that measured her weight and found her wanting until their eyes caught the pendant at her throat, and the calculation shifted. One of them silver-haired, expensively dressed, radiating the kind of authority that came from decades of having doors opened, studied her with unconcealed curiosity. "Manfredo tells us you have interesting instincts," he said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe it. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at this room?" It was a test, an invitation to fail publicly. Vicky met his gaze without blinking. "I see 3 men pretending this is a social call when it's actually negotiation. I see you testing whether Manfredo's judgment about me is sound or sentimental. And I see that you've already decided the answer, you're just curious if I'm aware enough to know it." Silence dropped over the corner like a curtain. Then the silver-haired man laughed, genuine, surprised, delighted. "She'll do," he said to Manfredo, raising his glass in salute. "Where did you find her?" "She found me," Manfredo replied. "The best ones usually do." Later, walking back to the car through streets that no longer felt threatening, Manfredo spoke quietly. "Your invisibility used to be survival. Now it's strategy. You can still disappear when you choose to, but you'll never be unseen again unless you decide to be." Vicky touched the pendant at her throat, warm from her skin and weighted with meaning she was only beginning to understand. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was someone who chose when to be seen. And in Manfredo's world, that made her dangerous. The invitation arrived on expensive cardstock with minimal text, a location, a time, and a dress code that indicated this wasn't optional. Manfredo handed it to Vicky over breakfast in his too-perfect kitchen, his expression unreadable as always. "What is this?" She studied the embossed lettering that probably cost more than her former weekly tips. "Your final examination." He sipped espresso, that was somehow never cold, never too hot, always exactly right. "Private gathering, very selective. People who move markets before breakfast and reshape policy before lunch." Vicky's stomach tightened. "And I'm invited because I recommended you, because the men you met at the club were impressed enough to be curious, and because perception is the real currency in rooms like this, and you've learned to read it fluently." He set down his cup with that precise control he brought to everything. But mostly because you're ready. I don't feel ready. Good. Overconfidence gets people killed. Controlled uncertainty keeps them sharp. Manfredo stood, straightening cuffs that were already perfect. Someone will bring your dress this afternoon. Wear the pendant. And remember, you're not there to serve these people anymore. You're there as an equal who happens to see what they're trying to hide. The dress arrived at 4, black, elegant, expensive enough to make her hands shake when she touched the fabric. It fit like it had been made for her body specifically, which it probably had been. The kind of garment that transformed posture, that made slouching feel like desecration. By 7, she stood in front of floor-to-ceiling mirrors, barely recognizing the woman reflected back. The exhausted waitress had been completely erased. What remained looked like someone born into rooms that required invitation, not someone who'd spent years serving people in them. The pendant gleamed against her collarbone, a statement and a warning. The gathering took place in a penthouse that made Manfredo's look modest. Art that belonged in museums hung on walls. Windows offered views that turned the city into a toy model. Men in tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than vehicles moved through spaces designed to remind them they'd won capitalism's lottery. Vicky entered beside Manfredo, and heads turned. Not because she was beautiful, though the dress and the training had taught her to carry herself like someone who deserved attention, but because she was unknown, a variable in an equation these people thought they'd already solved. Who is she? The whisper reached her from a cluster of women whose jewelry could fund small nations. Manfredo's new protégé, apparently. Protégé. The word carried skepticism. Is that what we're calling it? Vicky kept her expression neutral, her training kicking in like muscle memory. Let them speculate. Let them make assumptions. People revealed more about themselves through their questions than they ever did through their answers. Manfredo introduced her strategically, not to everyone, but to specific people whose attention mattered. A federal judge who smiled like a predator. A philanthropist whose charity work masked business interests that would make headlines if exposed. A tech CEO who'd built empires on contracts most people didn't know existed. Each conversation followed similar patterns. Polite questions designed to measure her worth. Veiled comments meant to establish hierarchy. Observations that were really interrogations. And Vicky met them all with the tools Manfredo had spent weeks sharpening. When the judge asked what she did, she replied, "I pay attention. Most people don't." Simple, true, impossible to dismiss. When the philanthropist suggested she must be overwhelmed by such company, she smiled and said, "I've spent years watching powerful people. The setting is new. The patterns are familiar. Polite, firm, refusing the diminishment disguised as concern." When the tech CEO tried to corner her with technical questions clearly meant to expose ignorance, she redirected, "I'm not here to discuss what you do. I'm here to understand why you do it. The technology is just tool. The motivation is what matters." It disarmed him completely. By the time dinner was announced, a 12-course affair that would take 3 hours, Vicky had been observed, measured, tested, and tentatively accepted. Not fully, not without reservation, but the room had decided she wasn't an accident or decoration. She was someone worth watching. Dinner seated her between a venture capitalist and a politician whose name she recognized from corruption investigations that had somehow never resulted in charges. Both men initially addressed their conversation around her, as if she were furniture positioned between them. Then the politician made a mistake. He was negotiating something with the venture capitalist, details deliberately vague, but clearly involving money moving through channels that avoided scrutiny. The kind of deal that happened in rooms like this precisely because rooms like this understood discretion. "The timeline concerns me," the venture capitalist said, cutting into beef that probably cost $100 per ounce. 6 months is aggressive. It's necessary. The politician's smile never wavered. The election cycle demands it. Vicky watched the exchange with the focused attention Manfredo had trained into her bones, and she saw what neither man realized: they were revealing the venture capitalist's left hand trembled slightly when discussing timeline. The politician checked his watch twice in 30 seconds when defending necessity. Fear versus performance. Desperation disguised as confidence. "Forgive me," she said quietly, and both men turned to her as if remembering she existed. "But you're negotiating a timeline neither of you actually believes is achievable. You," she addressed the venture capitalist, "know the infrastructure isn't ready, which is why your hand shakes when you commit to dates. And you," turning to the politician, "need this completed before oversight committees change hands after the election, which is why you keep checking time you don't actually have." Silence dropped over their section of the table like a guillotine. The venture capitalist's fork paused halfway to his mouth. The politician's practiced smile fractured at the edges. You're both posturing, Vicky continued, her voice carrying confidence she'd learned to perform even when her pulse hammered. Why not negotiate actual timelines based on actual capabilities instead of political theater? For 3 seconds, she thought she'd miscalculated catastrophically. Then the venture capitalist laughed short, surprised, genuine. She's right. I can't deliver in 6 months. 9, maybe. The politician's smile reformed into something more authentic. 9 works. If you can guarantee it. They shook hands over her plate, sealing a deal they'd been dancing around for the entire first course. The venture capitalist turned to her with renewed interest. Where did Manfredo find you? I found him, she said, echoing words she'd heard before. The best ones usually do. After dinner, the gathering fragmented into smaller conversations, deals made in corners, alliances formed over drinks, the real business of the evening happening away from the formal performance of the meal. Manfredo found her near the windows, where she'd retreated to process everything she'd witnessed. You made an impression, he said quietly. Several people have asked about you. Who you are, what you do, how you fit into my organization. What did you tell them? That you see what they'd prefer stayed hidden, and that you're someone they'd be wise to treat carefully. He studied her profile against the city lights. You did well tonight, better than well. You held your ground in a room designed to make people feel small. Vicky touched the pendant at her throat. I still feel like I'm pretending. Everyone in this room is pretending. The difference is you know it and they've forgotten. Manfredo turned toward the gathering, his gaze sweeping across faces and dynamics Vicky was only beginning to understand. Power is just performance backed by consequences. You've learned to see through the performance. That makes you more dangerous than half the people here. The evening concluded with the same choreographed politeness. It had begun goodbyes that were really promises to continue conversations privately, invitations that were really tests, smiles that meant nothing and everything. As they left, the silver-haired man from the club caught Vicky's arm gently. You questioned that negotiation at dinner, he said, his tone neutral. Bold, possibly foolish, but effective. He studied her with eyes that had witnessed decades of human calculation. People will remember you now. Make sure that memory serves you instead of destroying you. I'll remember that, Vicky said. See that you do. He released her arm. This world has no patience for those who can't navigate its currents, but it rewards those who can read them before they shift. In the car heading back, Manfredo was quiet for several blocks before speaking. Tonight was your introduction. The real test comes when you operate without me beside you. When you walk into rooms knowing you belong there not because I vouched for you, but because you've earned the right through perception and judgment. Vicky watched the city pass outside tinted windows. When does that happen? Sooner than you think. He glanced at her. You're no longer the woman who whispered a warning. You're someone people listen to when you speak. That's a transformation most people never achieve. And if I fail, then you'll have learned something valuable about your limitations. Manfredo's expression revealed nothing. But I don't think you will. You've survived everything thrown at you so far. Tonight was just proving you could do it while everyone was watching. The pendant felt heavy against her collarbone. No longer just protection, but identity. She was Vicky Warren. She'd been invisible by necessity. Now she was visible by choice. And in the world she'd entered, that made all the difference. Morning arrived with the persistent rain that turned Chicago's streets into rivers of reflected light. Vicky stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows in Manfredo's penthouse, her temporary home that had somehow become familiar, watching the city wake beneath clouds that promised the rain wouldn't stop anytime soon. Behind her, Manfredo worked through his morning routine with the precision that characterized everything he did. Espresso, newspaper. The quiet rituals of someone who understood that control began with the smallest choices. You're thinking too loudly, he said without looking up from his paper. Vicky smiled despite herself. How can thinking be loud? When it's the kind that comes before major decisions. He folded the paper with those exact creases. You've been different since the gathering. Quieter, more present. That means something shifted. She turned from the window, the city at her back. I keep thinking about who I was 2 months ago. The woman serving tables, counting tips, invisible. And I don't recognize her anymore. The admission felt like stepping off solid ground. It's not just the clothes or the pendant or the rooms I can access now. It's how I think, how I move, how I respond when someone tries to diminish me. She touched the pendant without thinking. I'm someone completely different. Manfredo studied her with those dark eyes that saw too much. You were always this person. You just didn't have permission to be her, or tools to protect yourself when you were. That's what scares me. Vicky moved to the counter, pouring coffee. Her hands knew how to prepare now, the expensive machine no longer intimidating. What if I like this version better? What if I can't go back even if I wanted to? You can't go back. His tone carried neither judgment nor sympathy, simply fact. That woman died in a parking lot when men decided you'd seen too much. What you built from that death is entirely yours. The coffee tasted the way everything in this world tasted, expensive, complex, nothing like what she'd known before. Manfredo's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression shifting microscopically, the kind of change Vicky had learned to read. Problem? She asked. Opportunity. He set the phone down. There's a negotiation happening this afternoon. Small meeting, delicate circumstances. I need someone there who can read the room better than the people performing in it. Vicky's pulse kicked up. You want me to go alone? I want you to do what you've been trained to do. Watch, analyze, report what you see that others miss. He poured his own coffee, the ritual somehow calming despite what he was proposing. It's time to see if you can operate without me as safety net. The address led to an office building in the financial district, glass and steel, and the kind of generic corporate luxury that made every floor look identical. Vicky entered wearing the armor of expensive clothes and the pendant that announced protection before she spoke a word. The receptionist's eyes caught the symbol immediately. Miss Warren, they're expecting you. Conference room C. The meeting was already in progress when she entered 4 men around a table covered in documents, their body language radiating tension barely constrained by professional courtesy. They looked up at her arrival with expressions ranging from confusion to calculation. Who are you? The oldest one demanded, his tone making it clear he didn't appreciate interruptions. An observer. Vicky took the empty chair at the end of the table, her posture conveying she belonged there regardless of their opinions. Continue. The youngest man, early 30s, expensive suit that didn't quite fit his frame, looked like he wanted to protest, but his eyes caught her pendant, and whatever complaint he'd prepared died unspoken. The negotiation resumed with the grudging energy of people performing for an unexpected audience. They were discussing a merger, or what they called a merger but was clearly an acquisition disguised as partnership. Numbers flew across the table, valuations, debt ratios, timeline projections, but beneath the financial language, something else was happening. Vicky watched with the focused attention Manfredo had spent weeks sharpening into instinct. The oldest man led the discussion but kept glancing at the youngest, checking for approval or permission. Patterns that indicated the real power didn't match the apparent hierarchy. The man to his right touched his wedding ring constantly, a tell that meant stress beyond the current negotiation. The third man barely spoke, but his eyes tracked every exchange with the assessment of someone calculating outcome, rather than participating in process. 20 minutes into the meeting, Vicky understood what she was seeing. This wasn't a negotiation. It was theater performed for her benefit, or more accurately, for whoever she represented. They thought she was Manfredo's eyes, which meant they were playing to an audience of one who could reshape deals with a word. Stop! Her voice cut through financial jargon like a blade. Foreheads turned, surprise and irritation mixing on professional faces. This isn't a real negotiation, she continued, her tone carrying the confidence Manfredo had trained into her bones. You're performing positions you don't actually hold, trying to create leverage that doesn't exist. The valuations are inflated on both sides. The timeline is impossible. And none of you actually want this deal, you want whatever happens after it collapses. Silence dropped like a stone. The oldest man's face darkened. You have no idea what you're talking about. Your associate checks with the youngest man before making any commitment, which means apparent seniority is fiction. The man on your right is distracted by personal crisis, probably divorce based on how often he touches his ring. And the quiet one hasn't contributed because he's waiting to see which side to support once positions solidify. Vicky leaned forward slightly. You're not negotiating. You're positioning for blame when this fails. The youngest man's expression shifted from anger to something that might have been respect. And why would we do that? Because failure here triggers insurance clauses that matter more than success. Because this meeting creates legal documentation that shifts liability. Because performance is more valuable than outcome. She held his gaze. Should I continue, or would you prefer I report exactly what I've observed to the people who sent me? The threat wasn't subtle. But subtlety would have been wasted on people this desperate to maintain fiction. After 5 seconds, the oldest man laughed, bitter, defeated, genuine. Manfredo wasn't exaggerating about you. He gathered his documents with hands that shook slightly. We're done here. Tell him we'll discuss actual terms when we're ready to be honest. They filed out, leaving Vicky alone in a conference room that still smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. Her phone buzzed. Manfredo, how did it go? She typed her response. They weren't negotiating. They were performing failure. I called it. They left. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Perfect. Come home. Home. The word shouldn't have fit, but somehow did. That evening, Vicky stood at the windows again, watching rain paint the city in streaks of reflected light. Manfredo joined her, 2 glasses of wine in hand, his presence somehow comfortable despite everything it represented. You did well today, he said, handing her a glass. Better than well. You saw through performance most consultants would have missed entirely. I just applied what you taught me. No. He turned to face her directly. You applied instincts you've always had. I just gave you permission to trust them and tools to protect yourself when you do. Vicky sipped wine that probably cost more than her former weekly rent. What happens now? That depends on what you want. Manfredo's expression revealed nothing. You've completed your training, proven yourself in rooms that eat unprepared people alive. You could continue as you are operating in my world, protected by my name, building reputation that opens doors most people never see. Or you take what you've learned and build something entirely yours. Use the skills, keep the connections, maintain the protection, but define your own path instead of walking one I've cleared for you. The choice felt enormous and simple simultaneously. Vicky thought about the woman she'd been invisible, exhausted, surviving through silence and service. She thought about the moment in that alley when everything had changed. She thought about rooms that used to be closed and conversations that used to happen without her presence. I spent 4 years being invisible because I thought it kept me safe, she said quietly. But safety through silence just meant accepting whatever life others decided I deserved. And now? Now I know visibility is a weapon. Attention is currency. And the ability to see what others miss is more valuable than any protection you could offer. She met his eyes. I want to build something mine. But I'd be foolish to pretend I don't need your support while I do. Manfredo smiled, genuine, rare, fleeting. Then that's what we'll do. You operate independently. Build your own network. Develop your own reputation, and when you need resources or protection, you know where to find them. He raised his glass. To the woman who whispered a warning and saved my life. Vicky touched her glass to his, the crystal chiming softly. To the man who listened, when most people wouldn't have. They drank. And below them the city continued its endless motion, people pursuing power, seeking safety, building empires and watching them crumble. Somewhere in that chaos, a waitress named Vicky Warren had ceased to exist. What remained was someone who'd learned that true power didn't come from strength or connections, or even from the symbol hanging at her throat. It came from awareness, from courage, from the willingness to act when silence was safer and easier, and infinitely more comfortable. It came from seeing what others missed and speaking when others stayed quiet. The rain continued falling, washing the city clean for another night, erasing yesterday's footprints, while tomorrow's patterns waited to be observed by anyone trained to see them. Vicky Warren was watching, and she would never be invisible again. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.